So as we move now into when the body starts to actually attack itself, called autoimmune disorders. Now Sam Yannock put this together and gave us the ideas of how to construct this into something that we can teach and understand. So primarily we have two types of immune reaction. We have the innate immune system, which, as we'll see, is built into all forms of biology to defend ourselves against infection. And we have the adaptive immune system, which comes into action more after a week or so, and promotes then the production of antibodies and autoimmune disorders. And when these Th1, Th2 systems are out of balance, as we'll see, it promotes the production of interleukin-17, which stimulates the production of Th17 cells, which drives the inflammatory process. So in the middle of this picture here, schematic, is inflammation. And that's the key part to an autoimmune disease, is its inflammation. So on the top of the above inflammation there, we have reactive oxygen species, which we know basically free radicals, or more specifically reactive oxygen species, drive the inflammatory process. And underneath there we have the immune side. So these three really build up the center part of an autoimmune disorder. So with an autoimmune disorder, you have a high level of free radicals or reactive oxygen species. You have high hallmarks of inflammation, like high C-reactive protein, etc. You have high NF-kappa B for reactive oxygen species. And you have an overactive immune system, which is usually mediated by a Th17. So in the heart of the autoimmune problem. Now, we've also got to look at all the reasons why this can be triggered, because these three are the cardinal sources, if I just move on to the next slide there, of most diseases. And some people will say that most chronic diseases, to an extent, are autoimmune unless you prove that they're not. So the immune system is always involved there. So autoimmune diseases tend to have one of the characteristic pathological effects, which characterize them as damage or destruction to the tissue, altered organ growth, and altered organ function. See, if I go back here, what Sam Yannock taught us was the prime driver of inflammation in the autoimmune response is infection. So we have to bear that in the back of our mind, that the prime reason for inflammation is infection. We know that that's not 100%, of course, because there's other things that can cause inflammation, leaving aside trauma, of course. We know that it can be driven by dysbiosis. So in other words, inflammatory byproducts produced from dysbiosis, or bad bacteria, inflammation in the gut, will get into the system and drive the inflammatory process. We know, we talked this morning about hypoxia, or lack of oxygen, will stimulate the production of superoxide, and also hypoxia will lead towards superoxide production from the porphyrin cascade, drives the inflammatory process. Certain foods, we have food allergens, and we also have naturally occurring chemicals within foods which can set up inflammatory reactions, histamine responses, and so on. So the foods that we eat, or some of the foods that we eat, may create inflammatory responses. We know that stress itself, the chemistry of stress, may have an inhibitory effect ultimately on the adrenal glands, on the adrenal cortex, and when the adrenal cortex is under functioning, we then have low levels of corticosteroids, as cortisol, so as a result we have lack of anti-inflammatory. So most autoimmune problems have burnt out adrenals, low levels of cortisol production. So if you've got high cortisol, which is one of the cures, if you like, or treatments for autoimmune, is to supplement with cortisol. So when people go onto steroids, they get almost instant relief of their symptoms. But of course, ultimately, that leads to side effects and bone thinning and so on. But it does indicate there's a strong link with all autoimmune disorders and the adrenal glands. We know that chemicals are detoxified, as we've learned, by cytochrome P450, which in turn then produces one atom of superoxide for every atom, every molecule of a toxin that we break down through cytochrome P450, and then we phase II it. So chemical toxins. Toxic metals, which we talked about in the last seminar, can drive this inflammatory process as well. Radiation, which we spent time yesterday discussing also in the last seminar discussing. So all these have arrows going in, and at the same time some of those you'll notice have arrows going back out, so the inflammation itself, inflammatory process, can add to the dysbiosis and add to the stress, of course, here. So autoimmunity is the presence of self-reactive immune responses. In other words, autoantibodies, self-reactive T cells, these special lymphocytes that go to the killing, with or without damage or pathology resulting from it. For instance, an example would be thyroiditis, where we've got acute inflammation of the thyroid, but not necessarily directly from an infection that we can locate, but there's these cardinal 3 aspects occurring in there. Or it involves a particular tissue in a different place, for instance, Goodpasture's disease, which affects the basement membranes in the kidneys and lung. So normally the adaptive immune system produces T cells and B cells that are capable of being reactive with self-antigens. So basically what this means is we produce antibodies and antigens against our own tissue, which seems foolish really, doesn't it, to actually go into a self-destruct process with our own immune system attacking our cells, primarily because it can't find the source of what it should be attacking. And then you get this molecular mimicry, which with the immune system thinks that that is a foreign invader because it has a similar chain of amino acids and starts to attack that. So that could be one of the reasons why this occurs. So when these mechanisms fail, leads to a reservoir of self-reactive cells that become active. Prevention of self-reactive cells takes place in the thymus as the T cell is developing into a mature immune cell. So this brings us back to that extract from Wally Smith's book, that the thymus is involved here very much with the adaptive immune system and problems. So here we see a normal immune response. Antigens invade. So here we've got our pathogens coming in, and then we form our antibodies. Antibodies remove the invading antigens, or in fact they don't actually remove, they lodge on and then the immune system attacks them, and then the antibodies remain and help protect as memory cells. So in other words, when we've had the infection and we produce the antibodies against that, we've always got a few antibodies left in the system for in case we're exposed to it again. The autoimmune disease, the immune system forms the antibodies to self-antigens. In other words, it's producing antibodies against its own tissue. The antibodies attack the self-antigens, and then inflammation and tissue succeed and create damage and irreversible pathology sometimes. And unless it's treated, it becomes progressive, and most autoimmune disease get worse and worse and worse, although some do seem to last for a few years and then so-called burn themselves out. So in both immune and inflammatory diseases, the condition, well really that's the same, the condition arises through the aberrant reactions of the human adaptive and innate systems. In autoimmunity, the patient's immune system is activated against the body's own proteins. In chronic inflammatory diseases, neutrophils and other leukocytes are constitutively recruited by cytokines and chemokines, leading to tissue damage. So the immune system the adaptive immune system basically works between the two helper cells, Th1, Th2, which help balance the response of the lymphocytes or the T cells to do the killing. So the killer is the T cell. So it's the one that goes into the pathogen and drills holes in it and punctures it and sprays it with chemicals and so on, free radicals. But the deciding guideline is to the left and the right, if you like, is Th1, Th2. And fundamentally, Th1 is involved with problems outside of the cell, like infections, and Th2 is more, Th1 is more inside the cell and Th2 is more outside the cell. So what happens when we have an autoimmune problem is we get an imbalance between these two. So instead of being nicely balanced and we get some Th1, Th2 keeping the T cell in order and control, what we're getting is a high Th2 or a high Th1. We very rarely, if ever, find a high Th1 and a low Th2. This seems to be abnormal. Most of the reason you explain is an underactive innate immune system before we got to this. So this is the more common pattern where we have high Th2 and low Th1. So the treatment, if you like, for this person would be to stimulate the Th1 cells to get the balance or to inhibit the Th2. And for many years this was generally the accepted pathway to go. What we've now learned from Sam is in fact that this leads towards the production of Th17, and Th17 is the real culprit that drives the inflammatory process. But just further back on the chain, we've still got to address this balance. So in this case, what would happen is Th2 is high, therefore Th2 would weaken as a marker. So as a marker, Th2 would weaken, and in this case, because it's low, Th1 would strengthen. So same basic rules with all functional biochemistry. If something is bad or in excess and creates a problem, it's going to weaken, and if something's necessary and good, it'll strengthen there. So the Th2 produces high antibody production, which can in turn lead to allergies and systemic autoimmunity. So this will be the people, as we'll see, who develop multiple allergies because they've got the high inflammatory process going on. So it's almost as if the immune system is overworking, but it's only this aspect of the immune system which is overworking. This part of the system is underworking. And if this part of the system was working better, this would calm down. So a lot of these people with multiple allergies is because they've got an underactive immune system on the opposite side. So all chronic diseases have the following in common. Autoimmune diseases are typical examples of oxidative stress, the key parts to that diagram, inflammation, and overactive or underactive immune systems. So we said one of the theories of this, of what happens, is molecular mimicry, where the antibodies think that the antigen is a foreigner, but in fact it's actually part of its own mechanism, its own tissue structure, but it thinks it's a foreigner because the code on it recognizes is the same as on an infection or some other antigen. So if I just whip on there, a good example of that would be type 1 diabetes, where the pancreas is destroyed, the pancreatic beta cells are destroyed by the immune system because it thinks that is the same as an infection of some form. And sometimes there is an infection, and the infection can't be found by the immune system, and it may be that some of these infections are a little bit more subtle than straightforward viruses and bacteria, and maybe mycoplasma, which are bacteria which don't have cell membranes. So these are stealth bacteria, if you like, pathogens that can set up inflammatory reactions, but because they've got no cell surface markers, the immune system can't recognize where they are. So they've got a cell, but no cell surface on them, and so they can wander around and squeeze themselves between various tissues and set up problems, and the immune system can't find them, so it just fires away, trying with the desperate hope that it's going to kill them off. So type 1 diabetes often comes about after an infection, possibly a viral infection, and maybe that's gone or not found, and then the body sets up these antibodies against the virus or mycoplasma, whatever it might be, and then the autoimmune system swings in and it recognizes the codings, if you like, the amino acid structures, and thinks that's the virus or the pathogen, but in fact it's the beta cells of the pancreas and destroys it, which is why a lot of people get diabetes very quickly. They can be perfectly all right, and then they can end up diabetic, within a day or so. That's called molecular mimicry. Now, in this particular book, Secret of Your Cells, which Jill introduced us to, the basic job of our immune system is to recognize self and others. So what the immune system should know, this is me, and that's the foreigner, while collaborating with the brain, the gut, the thoughts, the beliefs, and the hormones. In autoimmune, the recognition of self is compromised. Our own cells are no longer identified as us and thus become an enemy, if you like. Whether that's the actual case or whether it's trying to find the enemy, and as I say, just hits the wrong target. In addition to mistaken identity, this response fails to be suppressed. So in other words, they fail to get it under order to reduce the inflammation, so it just goes on. So a list of the common autoimmune diseases, and there's probably quite a few hundred which fulfill this criteria, but the ones we mostly heard about is Addison's disease, where we've got burnt out adrenal cortex, celiac disease, where we've got sensitivities to gluten, gliadin, and maybe other proteins in grains, Crohn's disease, which is largely in the small intestine, hyperplasia, endometriosis, which is growth in the uterus, the endometrium, inflammatory bowel disorder. This sort of covers a multitude of problems, really, doesn't it? Inflammatory bowel disorder, multiple sclerosis, myasthenia gravis, polymyalgia rheumatica, polymyositis, psoriasis, overproduction of the dermal tissue in the skin, rheumatoid arthritis, scleroderma, Sjogren's syndrome, affecting the eyes, etc., systemic lupus erythematosus with the butterfly shape around the nose, temporal arteritis, inflammation of the temporal arteries, thyroiditis, inflammation of the thyroid, stroke Hashimoto's or Graves' disease. This is an overactivity, overproduction of thyroid hormones, which then burns the thyroid out and then they go into a hypo state. Type 1 diabetes, as I just mentioned, vasculitis, which could include phlebitis on there, and vitiligo when we have paling of the skin or loss of melanin pigment there. So common elements in autoimmune, hereditary genetics. These disorders don't necessarily run in families. So it could be that if one person has a particular autoimmune problem, there's somebody in the family who's also got it. It's not that common, but genetics, of course, is common. Everything is genetics at the end of the day, is do we have the ability within our gene expression to repair the problem? And if that particular chromosome or gene is not functioning, then the answer is no. So the answer here is, why is that gene not functioning, and what can we give to upregulate it so that it can express itself? So hereditary, these defects may not be hereditary, they can be acquired, but certainly genetics is involved in everything, really. Environmental factors, yes, of course. Again, everything is environmental. We've talked about electromagnetic pollution, chemical pollution, toxic metal pollution. Any form of pollution has to be dealt with. So these are environmental factors. Viral infection, yes, we don't know. It's difficult sometimes to know specifically whether it's a virus or it could be a mycoplasma or some other pathogen like a parasite, etc., that we talked about this morning. Psychological stress, yes, because psychological stress is the thought process, maybe through the subconscious, which then alters the brain chemistry, and that change in the brain chemistry gives us the feeling of the emotional problem, the turmoil, and then we run that program, and if that program is affecting our liver, or let's say our spleen meridian, it's driving a high histamine all the time, which will lead to autoimmune problems. Mutation in certain genes, yes indeed. Molecular mimicry, we just talked about mistaken identities. Damage or self-structures targeted for apoptosis, mistakenly exposed by the immune system. So again, that's like a self-destruct process. Hormonal factors, certainly with the adrenals, thymus, we mentioned those. Underfunctioning adrenal cortex will lower cortisol production, which is anti-inflammatory. Hormonal factors. Vitamin D deficiency, as we'll see later, especially of the activated forms of vitamin D involved with the immune system, which would be the 24-25 vitamin D, as opposed to the 125, which is the calcium one. And vitamin A deficiency, again, which is very important with the epithelial tissue, and it's the epithelial tissue that lines all the hollow tubes, hollow spaces in the body, and it's those that are particularly vulnerable to allergic reactions with high Th2, of producing secondary infections and recurrent infections, what we call hollow tube infections. Right, so as we mentioned, one of the ways to know that we have an imbalance between the Th1 and the Th2 driving this inflammatory condition is Th1, Th2. Does Th1 weaken and Th2 strengthen, or Th2 weaken and Th1 strengthen. So think of it as the seesaw like that, and it'll always be like that and that. It's never that or that. You know, it's always a balance between those two. And in the middle, you've got, if you like, your T cell, your killer cells in there. So do we steer it this way towards intracellular pathogens, or do we steer it that way to extracellular pathogens? So that's basically the sort of Th1, Th2. So here we see that one again, Th2 excess, which is more common, Th1 deficiency. So when there's a lowered immune system function, we need to increase the immune system activity. Obviously here, if we've got a Th1 that's down, we need to increase it. When there's an increased system function, we need to decrease the immune response as an autoimmune disorder. So it's generally recognised that there are two parts to the immune system, as we talk, the innate and the adaptive. So the question is, what part of the immune system should we increase or decrease? The innate system or the adaptive system, in other words, the T1, T2. The solution in the majority of patients is to optimize the innate system function rather than focus only on the adaptive immune system. This actually makes life a lot easier because what we find is that the adaptive system is adapting, bringing it in, because the innate system is not working. Okay, it's an underfunctioning of the innate system, which is, for us, is much easier to understand, because that's what we dealt with this morning. So the innate system is bringing in the neutrophils and the macrophages. Is it a gram positive? Is it a gram negative? But more importantly, is it killed on the right-hand side by reactive oxygen species like hypochlorite, or is it killed on the nitrate series with nitric oxide? And that's really the basis of the whole thing. What we want to know is it an autoimmune problem? Does the patient have high Th17? And if it is it Th1, Th2, which is that? They're markers for us, that's all. We needn't dwell on that. We need just to say, well, if a person weakens to Th2, they're high, and therefore we can find the remedy which negates that weakness. And the same with Th17. But luckily, if we view it in our mind, that most adaptive immune systems are a result of an inactive innate system, or the first part. So here we see again the schematic of the immune system, innate, which is inborn into us. So the programs are already in there. So we don't have to worry about training ourselves to send our neutrophils in. They're already in there, and it's in every animal, and even plants have this. So they have ways of fighting diseases inborn into it. It's non-specific, so it doesn't tackle any particular type of bug. It just goes to the kill, and we kill by reactive oxygen species and the complement cascade. The adaptive system, as we see, is acquired because we've had the infection in for a period of time. We built up antibodies, and it's very specific, you know, against rubella. This one's against morbillium and so on. We build antibodies specific to specific viruses and build them. So the innate immune system is the body's initial response to eliminate microbes and infections immediately or within hours. Non-specific defense against pathogens, it activates the complement. It has no long-lasting or protective immunity because it's always there, and the adaptive immune system does that. The adaptive, it gives us the protection and then the long-term immunity. The innate immune system triggers inflammation. It identifies and removes the foreign substance. It attracts phagocytes, so they're mainly the neutrophils and macrophages, which basically go in, engulf the bacteria or the foreign air, spray it with reactive oxygen species, and then digest it and spit it out as pus. So we're familiar with this from this morning. So it's the same process here of us occupying or utilizing this pathway here for the gram positives and this pathway for the gram negatives or the bacteria. So is the foreigner killed by nitric oxide or is it killed by reactive oxygen species like hypochlorite is the question. So if you want to test each of these, superoxide, we use superoxide. These are all in the immune system box and in other kits as well. So the superoxide is superoxide plus NAD pH. this would be the way we can mimic superoxide. So free radicals are things that only last for fractions of a second. So you can't put a free radical in a bottle and say, well, this is a free radical. What you can do is put the superoxide plus the extra electron or hydrogen there, and then you put the two together, and that's when the body reacts to it. Hydrogen peroxide is hydrogen peroxide. So hydrogen peroxide is not a free radical, but it is a reactive oxygen species, as you'll soon find out if you spill it on your hand and your skin goes white. Okay, so it is a reactive oxygen species, it's a bleacher. Hypochlorite is, of course, hypochlorite, which is household bleach, and that's the best marker to actually use. Hydroxyl radical is a combination of superoxide and the NADPH plus peroxide. So think about the cascade, how we're making it. So what would happen is we put peroxide and superoxide together. Nitric oxide is the best marker for that. And peroxynitrite, as I said, is when superoxide and nitric oxide come together non-enzymatically. So you just simply got to put those two vials together. So we talked this morning about how to boost the innate immune system, and first of all to increase the respiratory burst by heating spices and things like ginger, particularly the ginger tincture, to produce superoxide. Okay. And then zinc or copper to stimulate superoxide dismutase to convert superoxide to hydrogen peroxide. And then silver to block the catalase and stimulate myeloperoxidase. And then maybe to supplement also some form of iodine, bromine or chlorine to make the hypochlorite if necessary. So screening for remedies, if it's on the nitric oxide side, we may screen for arginine to stimulate nitric oxide, maybe vitamin C and zinc, as these are also cofactors for inducible nitric oxide synthase, and maybe selenium to inhibit viral replication, which is put into certain products specifically to inhibit viruses. So screening remedies for innate immune system, which you may consider particularly remedies rather than nutrients, would be astragalus, golden seal, cayenne pepper, olive leaf, blackcurrant. I mentioned briefly about vitamin C with iron to try and stimulate the Fenton reaction for stubborn viruses, and maybe mycoplasma as well. Glucosamine has an opsonin there, echinacea, garlic, ginger, lemon balm, and bilberry. These are all impressive immune system stimulants.